This is Richard Featherstone from mybibledevotions.com, and I want to take a few minutes to discuss one important practical lesson from 1 Samuel chapter 3. Hopefully you've read this chapter, and if so, you're familiar with the fact that we're going to be talking a bit about the family dysfunction of Eli. In particular, I think it will be interesting to ask ourselves a couple questions. The first question that I have for us is, what kind of leader was Eli? And we learn about him in the first and second chapter, and now as we move into this third chapter, we gain a bit more insight. So I think if we go back to the second chapter, we read this very important verse. So why do you scorn my sacrifices and offerings? Why do you give your sons more honor than you give me? For you and they have become fat from the best offerings of my people Israel. This is a quote from an anonymous prophet of the Lord who came to warn Eli about the bad situation that he was in. And the thing I want to point out in this particular statement from the prophet of the Lord who's speaking to Eli is he's saying, look, you're failing in your job. You are scorning my sacrifices and offerings. And as the high priest, this is an area that you're supposed to get right. How you are to sacrifice these gift offerings to me at the tabernacle. And you're not doing that job well. And the second thing is that there is this part about Eli becoming fat from the best offerings. And we learned in chapter 2 that Eli's sons were essentially taking the meat offered by force and using that meat apparently to sell in the marketplace and to make money. And while Eli may not have been directly involved, he was benefiting from his son's corruption activity. So we're going to say that the second part of Eli as a leader was that he was benefiting, if not directly involved in corruption. So we can see here that Eli wasn't a great leader. He's failing at his job. He's also engaged, or at least benefiting from corruption. Now, what kind of person would he be to work for, however? What kind of boss would Eli be? Well, we get some insight into that here in chapter 3, and we can see that through the interaction he has with Samuel, this young man, this young boy, who serves as his assistant. So if we look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 3 through 5, it says, Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied. What is it? He got up and ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? This is a very important verse that you can read through really quickly and miss a couple important details. And these are details that inform us about what kind of boss Eli was. First, I want you to notice that Samuel was sleeping. So he had most likely a long day and he had finally gotten to bed. And yet, when he hears his voice being called, he assumes it is his master, Eli. And he gets up and he runs to him. So imagine that you are an assistant to Eli. And what's expected, as I say here in point 1, is that Eli wants his assistant to immediately respond 24 hours a day. Okay, so if you had Eli as a boss, then you can expect to be on call at all hours, and that boss wants you there immediately. Very demanding. Let's move on. Another verse from chapter 3 that's really enlightening about Eli as a boss. What did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything, and may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me. This is Eli talking to Samuel after Samuel has been given this word from the Lord. And Eli wants to know what it is that the Lord told Samuel. And how does he do that? Does he ask kindly? Does he say, hey, I'm curious about this? No, he is very intimidating and scary. He actually says to this boy, may God strike you and even kill you. some pretty strong language from the high priest. So we see here that he wasn't a softy Santa Claus figure that gives you an encouraging hug, but one who was high demand and also would be intimidating and scary. Third point about Eli as a boss. In verse 18, so Samuel told Eli everything. He didn't hold back anything. And then Eli responds, it is the Lord's will. Let him do what he thinks is best. So get this, right before verse 18, we find out that God is saying to Samuel that he is going to do what he told Eli he was going to do, and he's basically going to kill Eli and his family and never let another one of his family members serve as a priest. And this is some pretty serious stuff. And what does Eli respond to that? He says, hey, it's the Lord's will. Let him do what he thinks is best. So this is a boss who really didn't care anymore, right? This is someone that had basically punched his ticket and was not there to do the job. So in summary, imagine that Eli was your boss, because he certainly was the boss for Samuel. And we could summarize him as a leader and as a boss in the following ways. He was irresponsible, he was corrupt, he was demanding, he was threatening, and he was apathetic. Not a boss that any of us would probably want to work for. And yet some of you are probably saying, well, wait a second, Richard, I've actually worked for a boss like that before, or I've worked for some bad bosses in my life, and I know what those are like. So if that's the case for you, then I think you're going to get some great insights. You're probably way ahead of me on this from this particular chapter, because it's going to talk to us about how to deal with a problematic authority figure. So I say problematic authority figure because it doesn't necessarily have to be a boss. It may not be an employment issue. It could be that you have a really problematic or mean parent, a bad coach, a professor that is unreasonable and unfair. Whatever that authority figure is in that situation or in your life, we're going to be looking from chapter 3 about how do you as a Christian try to work with those people, if at all. So let's go ahead and look at that. The first thing that this chapter is teaching us through the work of Samuel is that we need to see the relationship we have with a bad boss or with a hard parent as a way to serve God by serving our superiors well. Now, let me put in a caveat there, because I know there's a few of you out there that are going to say, wait a second, right? You shouldn't work for somebody who's engaged in illegal activity. You shouldn't help them, condone their activity, assist them in their work. And I say, absolutely, I totally agree. And in fact, in Ephesians 5:11, the Apostle Paul tells us, take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them. Okay? The great passage, I think a lot of Christians miss that, right? Ephesians 5:11, take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them. So the thing you should realize is if you have a corrupt boss or an abusive, physically abusive parent, or maybe even very verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, or other types of serious problems coming from an authority figure, don't put up with it. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying, though, is if you're in a situation like Samuel, which you didn't have a choice, or you're in a situation where your boss is flawed, they're not engaging in illegal activities, but they're a flawed person, they're really hard to deal with, and you're just not able to get into a new job, a new role, then you should, first of all, see your service to them as service to God. And in fact, in Ephesians, again, that same book, 6:5, Paul says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Okay? Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Paul's basically telling us something that's really difficult, and that is, if you are in a situation where you can't necessarily get out of it, you can't find a different job right away, then serve those flawed people, those hard masters, as it were, as best you can, as if you were serving Jesus himself. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say in the first part. The next lesson from chapter 3 is be willing to learn from those with more knowledge and experience. As we're going to see here in this passage, Samuel was actually able to learn from Eli. Just because Eli is seriously messed up, his family's messed up, he's not doing a good job, as we talked about earlier, about taking responsible action regarding his bad sons, there's still things that you can learn from him, and there's still things that any of us can learn from bosses that aren't necessarily doing the right thing. In fact, let me give you a quick example in my own life where I was a young faculty member at the University of Northern Iowa. I had agreed to become an interim department head just for a year, seemingly. And so I was about ready to start that. And my wife and I had gone out to dinner, and we had invited a couple of faculty who were not Christians to come to dinner with us. And as I was sitting there having dinner, one of the faculty members knew I was about ready to become the new department head. And so he says to me, well, how are you preparing for that? And I responded with all sincerity. I said, well, one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I stay humble. And without missing a beat, this non-Christian faculty member says to me in all seriousness, he says, yeah, and I'm guessing there's so much you have to be proud of that you better work at being humble. And at first, I thought about that, and I thought, well, that's a rude thing to say. What's this guy's problem? But I thought about it later, and I realized that there's an insight there. There was something I could learn from that comment, however he intended it, whether it was a sarcasm, whether it was just a diss at me. I'm not really sure to this day, but I think there was some truth to it. He was basically saying, yeah, you're saying you need to stay humble because really underneath it all, you're saying you have so much to be proud of. And it was a great reminder to me that even when you try to attack the issue of pride, it's always there. Pride is a very dangerous flaw in ourselves, because whenever we think, yeah, I'm beating down on pride, I'm so happy and so successful in my attack on my own pride, is when you're actually losing against pride. Pride comes out in its own defeat. A strange thing there. So the second point is learn from those who have more knowledge and experience than us, even when these people are kind of not very good leaders. There's still things, because they're in that leadership role and been there a long time, that they can teach us. So be willing to learn. Now, the third point is, and this could probably be the hardest of the three, be courageous and share the truth with these people. Okay? So you're trying to deal with a problematic authority figure. How can you be courageous and share the truth with them? It means sharing your faith, absolutely, but sometimes it means sharing the facts that they're involved in some bad behavior and they shouldn't continue on. And you got to have the courage to stand up and let them know. All right, so to summarize this in 3 words, because sometimes people want it even shorter, is serve, learn, share. Those are the essential lessons that we're going to learn in this next section. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this first serve issue. So what's really interesting is that if you were paying attention in chapter 2, you're going to see a verse that shows up again in chapter 3. And that is the very beginning of chapter 3. It says, meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. This is a pretty powerful verse. It's interesting that it says Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. So it isn't that the Lord's work was getting done through Eli, who was being helped by Samuel. But no, it's a direct line. Samuel is serving the Lord by assisting Eli. And I think it's a reminder to us that we can actually still do kingdom work and still serve God, even when we're in a bad job, or we're dealing with a parent that's really hard, or a coach that just isn't fair, we can still do the Lord's work. And so I've created a little diagram to show what this could represent. So if we put Eli in this role, I'm just going to call him a bad leader, because like I said, it doesn't have to be a boss. It could be a parent, it could be a coach, it could be a teacher. It's some type of authority figure, and they're not good at what they do. They're not necessarily a great influence on you, but you are in this subordinate position, okay? You don't have much control or influence over this person, all right? And you still have a responsibility perhaps to serve this person. So you can serve them, all right, as long as they're not, like I said before, engaging in illegal and unethical behavior. In that situation, you got to get out. In fact, if you're working under a bad leader and you have the opportunity to move on, I recommend that you do. I've been in situations where I had to work for a bad leader. It never goes well over a period of time. But anyway, that's a different issue right there. But you can serve that bad leader in a way that serves God, right? And one part of that is God doesn't want you to start doing what the bad leader does. God doesn't want you to pick up their bad traits. Notice the arrow isn't going from the bad leader to you. It's you serving with humility, with professionalism, with godliness, that bad leader. And in the process, that is serving God. Okay, so the next issue is going to be about the issue of learning. Samuel was young. He had grown up expecting to do whatever he was told by Eli. I mean, he had been with Eli and the rest of the priests since he was probably 3 years old. And so he didn't know much of a different life. And so he served and he listened and he did what they told him. And so it was probably easier for him than many of us to take on that learning role. So as we get to the point of the story where Samuel hears his voice, his name being called by some voice, he thinks it's Eli, and he repeatedly goes to Eli and says, "Yes, I'm here. What do you want?" Eli is aware, as the high priest, with some knowledge and experience, that, hey, you need to not just keep running to me. And so if we go to that passage in verses 8 and 9, this is the part where Eli realizes that it's the Lord calling Samuel. And so he said to Samuel, "Go and lie down again, and if someone calls again, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel had no idea who's calling him. He doesn't know how to respond to God. And he basically is in a immature, not knowledgeable state. And this bad leader, believe it or not, Eli, has something that he can teach the boy Samuel. And that's something that we have to recognize. Eli is the one that tells Samuel, just stay in your bed and then just tell the Lord that you're listening. And so that's exactly what Samuel does, and God, in fact, reveals himself to Samuel. So this is a good lesson for us to also look for ways to learn from those bosses that we don't necessarily respect or that we feel are very flawed. And so I've kind of created a diagram for that. There's going to be times in our life where the bad leader is giving us information, ideas, thoughts, demands. And I've kind of drawn this dotted dashed line around us. Okay, so you're in the subordinate role again, and you're getting all this input from the bad leader. And the issue is not to take in whatever they tell you and say, okay, whatever they tell me, I'm going to do, because they're going to give you a bunch of junk. You've got to filter that junk through a process of saying, does this align with what God wants me to do? And then you're going to take that information that they give you, and you're going to put it through the lens of Scripture and wisdom. And then I want you to think about how that can be used to advance the kingdom of God, that it can be used to help you grow in your relationship with God. And it may be that you're simply saying, okay, this is something I'm not going to do in the future. Lord, help me not to fall into this trap. So it could be that. But it could be that you very well discover, like I did through my story, of that one faculty member saying, yeah, there's just so much you have to be proud of, that even if that was a flippant remark, it's something I could learn from and go, yeah, I do have to be careful about my pride deceiving me and making me think that I am humble. So we want to have that learning role here. That's really important. So Samuel is willing to learn from Eli. He stays in his bed. He says, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And then God has this conversation with Samuel. And what's interesting about that is that God delivers a message to Samuel that Samuel can then pass on to Eli. And he's really afraid of doing that. And it's not just because he's a boy and he doesn't want to hurt Eli's feelings. No, if you look at the context which we've covered, Eli was a tough master. And he's very much worried about how Eli is going to respond literally to him when he hears this bad news reiterated. And so Samuel really doesn't want to share the bad news that he's hearing from God with Eli. But Eli basically tells him, you better tell me, or, I'm going to basically ask that the Lord, do you in and kill you. And so it says in verse 18, so Samuel told Eli everything. He didn't hold anything back. And I'm going to pause right there, because what that is really saying to us is that Samuel chose not to sugarcoat it, not to downplay it, but to just be completely honest. And as we're going to see in this next part, Samuel didn't get punished for that. In fact, Eli responds in an almost bizarre way of just like apathy. Oh, well, I guess that's what God's going to do. He's going to destroy me and my family. But he doesn't get angry at Samuel. And I think that's an important lesson for us, is that we have to speak the truth and not worry about ourselves. We have to trust that in the end, if we're speaking honestly and in a way that God would be desiring us to speak, then we just have to allow God's words to speak to that person's heart. So I've got a diagram for that as well. You can see here that God is directing a message through you as the subordinate to the bad leader. And it's kind of a throughput, because while you're learning from that message, right, hopefully Samuel himself was learning about the importance of doing what is right and pleasing God. We're going to see some interesting things about Samuel and his kids later, but he had a responsibility to share with Eli that bad but truthful news. And we too have to be willing to, at the very minimum, share our faith with those authority figures that have so much problems. But oftentimes, with God's help and wisdom and prayer, we need to share the hard truth in a wise way with those bad leaders around us. So that's why I've drawn this particular figure to help us remember. Now, I'm going to put this all together in a 3-part diagram. The first part, as you'll remember, is how do we deal with problematic authority figures, bad leaders, bad parents, bad supervisors, coaches, teachers? Well, one is we have to remember that we can still serve God through professional service to that leader. Second, we can learn from them as long as we're taking the information that they're giving to us and using the Bible as our filter to learn how we can serve God and advance the kingdom. And then we will have a responsibility, this might be the hardest part, to share the truth with these people about how their bad behavior, their bad responses to things are not going to lead them in a good direction. They're not helping the organization, they're helping the family. So we just have to be wise, but we have to be willing to be courageous in sharing that. And certainly we need to be looking for ways to share our faith. So I've created a handout with these 3 diagrams on it. If you're a person that likes to have something material, you can print it off, and you can get that particular diagram from the website mybibledevotions.com. I encourage you to visit there, go to the section 1st and 2nd Samuel, and look at the resources available. You'll see there's a handout for chapter 3. So this particular message, a little bit longer than I'm used to, but I think some really important things here, a nice contrast from some of the earlier conversations we've had about what to do when, particularly we were talking about when you're in a leadership role, what should you be doing regarding your supervisees that are off the rails. Here we're in the subordinate role, and what should we do when we have a boss or parent or coach or teacher who's kind of not on track. So hope it's been helpful to you. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it in the comments section. And so God bless, and we'll see you in chapter 4.